Welcome, friends. Welcome to another episode of Indian Christian. And when we debate atheists, when the atheists and the theists debate, one point which keeps coming very often is the problem of evil and suffering. Because the theist says that God is always good, but then they put back saying that there is so much evil in this world, there is suffering in this world, and therefore there is no God, or even if God is there, he is not all good. This is their natural path they take. But then there is some understanding which most people do not take into consideration. And what should I say? Who is better to deal with this kind of problem than Professor John Lennox of Oxford University? If you have watched those debates between John Lennox and Richard Dawkins, you could always understand that when it comes to John Lennox, Richard Dawkins is always found wanting. He tries to scramble up things and try to grab, some bits and pieces to try to stand before him. You can see that there is no genuineness in Richard's argument. He is pushing his bandwagon, but when it comes to real genuinity, it's lacking. All over, it's lacking. So here we go with what Professor John Lennox would like to say about the problem of evil and suffering. But before that, I would also like to let you know that Richard Dawkins basically is dishonest. When it comes to debating, he would not debate the strong guy, but he would debate the weak guys. In Christianity, the bishops or the pastors, they are not good debaters. They might be good teachers. But would you want to debate a good teacher? Because a teacher's orientation is not that of a debater. But when he is asked to debate a good debater, he just gets out of the way saying that, oh no, he's busy. First, watch this Richard Dawkins excuse, and then we will proceed to John Lennox speaking on the reason for evil and suffering in this world.
Professor Dawkins, you are arguably the world's leading apologist for atheism, and you have been invited on several occasions by arguably the world's leading Christian academic apologist, Dr. William Lane Craig, to engage in debate. I would like to know why this is not an example of the new atheist doing what Lord Harries has described as avoiding the strongest possible arguments from the opposition.
Okay,
Thank you.
That's a very straight question. Over here now. I have always said when invited to do debates that I will be happy to debate a bishop, a cardinal, a pope, an archbishop. Indeed, I have done both. But that I don't take on creationists, and I don't take on people whose only claim to fame is that they are professional debaters. They've got to have something more than that. I'm busy.
He gave his answer with a number of excuses in there. Some things about only debating bishops and stuff, which he's debated non-bishops. He says he didn't debate creationists. William Lane Craig is not a creationist. He affirms, that the universe is billions of years old. He uses the Big Bang in the Kalam argument. And then, of course, most famously, he said, I'm busy. Well.
An oncologist sees cancer in a very different way from the patient who's just been told she has 6 months to live. The question of suffering and evil will look very different if you're a spectator theoretically trying to analyze the problem, or if you're a person who's participating at this moment in deep and hard to understand suffering. So there are two perspectives. There's an intellectual side to our question, and there's a pastoral side. People's hearts are breaking. I remember when my sister telephoned me and told me that her lovely daughter of 22, just married, had a brain tumor, an earthquake in the brain. What do you say? I didn't have an earthquake in my brain. So I had to face the question theoretically. She had to face it. And the pain that it involved. It's hard. And part of the difficulty in handling it is that I know in an audience like this, our experience of suffering is vast. We observe it, but we maybe have experienced in our own lives and the way we've been treated by our parents, maybe even. And so I shall try as best I can. I shall fail, but I shall try as best I can to be sensitive to it. I remember years ago, and it's happened many times, but this is typical. I was in a country far away, and I was having breakfast with two Jewish friends from Israel. They were brilliant engineers. And we started to talk, and the question of God came up, and I said to them, how do you stand? And they said, we don't believe in God. And I said, that's odd, because part of my reason for believing in God is your history. Well, they said, we don't actually believe in God. And I said, would you tell me why? And I remember the man saying, he said, no, I don't want to tell you why. Well, I said, that's all right. So we went on talking, and I could see husband and wife, them looking at each other, and they came to a decision, and he suddenly said, we're going to tell you why. But he said, don't blame me if it destroys your faith. And I said, well, you know, my faith in God is evidence-based. If it's destroyed by what you say, it wasn't worth having in the first place. So he said, all right. He said, my wife and I love literature. We read books to each other. And we were reading a book by Bashevis Singer, the brilliant Israeli Nobel laureate for literature. He wrote a book called The Slave. And he said, we were reading this book one evening, and we came across a passage where Singer described a horrific event in Russia where Jewish women and children were buried alive. And I'll never forget this man. With pain in his eyes, he said to me, in that moment, the light went out.
Hey friends, a very short interruption. If you have not yet subscribed to this channel, please do subscribe. And if you would like to give a like button, please do that. Put in your comments. And now over to Professor John Lennox.
And we've never believed in God since. So what do you say? He was looking at it theoretically, but of course I knew he'd lost so many of his relatives in the Holocaust. And I've been in Auschwitz many times, ladies and gentlemen, and I've wept every time. That's one example of moral evil that could be multiplied, of course. So I said to them, all right then, there's no God. And they looked at me strangely and they said, we thought you believed in God. I said, yes, I do, but you seem to have solved the problem. There is no God. That is just the way the universe is. And I couldn't help thinking of Richard Dawkins when he talks about the ultimate nature of reality in this direction. And when he says this universe is just as you would expect it to be. In a universe of blind physical forces and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt, other people are going to get lucky, and you won't find any rhyme or reason in it or any justice. The universe we observe, writes Dawkins, has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at the bottom no design, no purpose, no evil and no good. Nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. DNA neither knows nor cares. DNA just is. And we dance to its music. I've mentioned that to Richard Dawkins publicly several times. He's never retracted it. And ladies and gentlemen, we need to face this analysis because it is increasingly prevalent in the academy. Listen carefully to what it says. There is no good, there is no evil. But half a minute. Do I hear Richard Dawkins complaining that God is evil? I do. But if there's no good and no evil, that is a meaningless statement. Now, this is enormously important. I know it's theoretical, but it is important. The logical consequence of Dawkins' attitude is to abolish the categories of good and evil. But if you do that, ladies and gentlemen, it's idle to talk about God being evil or the world being evil, because there isn't any good or evil. Now, the reason, of course, that Dawkins still talks about evil is that he discovers, as you and I discover, all of us, that we are moral beings. Whether we believe in God or not, we've got a sensitivity to right and wrong, to good and bad, to justice and injustice, and therefore, whether we are an atheist or not, we look at Auschwitz and we say it's evil. Yes? But that's beginning to make a hole in naturalism. Because if the logical consequence of believing there is no God is to abolish the categories of good and evil, then the logical consequence of admitting that these categories exist is to reintroduce the possibility that there is a God with all the problems that that brings with it. We've had some awful shootings in recent days. If the shooters were just dancing to the music of their DNA, can you blame them? Of course not. 9/11. Just dancing to the music of their DNA, were they? How could you possibly blame them? We know in our hearts that that cannot be true. But there's the problem, ladies and gentlemen. If Epicurus is right, if naturalism is right, then ultimately good and evil are non-categories. Or at best, they're categories we have simply invented, and they're subject to a relativistic whim. There's no absolute character to them. Charles Taylor, in his brilliant book, The Secular Age, writes this: the modern age, more or less repudiating the idea of a divine lawgiver, has nevertheless tried to retain the ideas of moral right and wrong, not noticing that in casting God aside, they have also abolished the conditions of meaningfulness for moral right and wrong as well. And that is a supreme irony to my mind. And so, although atheism seems immediately to offer a solution, this is just how it is, it's brute fact, we have to accept it. Actually, it doesn't offer a solution at all. It makes the situation even more difficult. Friedrich Nietzsche saw this, of course, very clearly, more clearly than many other people, that the consequence of abandoning the traditional biblical morality that is at the heart of Western civilization would lead essentially to the philosophy of the strong eliminating the weak. And he puts it very powerfully. He says the biblical prohibition, thou shalt not murder, is a piece of naivety. Life itself recognizes no solidarity, no equal rights between the healthy and the degenerate parts of an organism. One must excise the latter, cut it out, or the whole will perish. Why morality, asked Nietzsche, at all, when life, nature, and history are non-moral? But are they? And again, I come back to the fact that we discover in ourselves that moral compass. We're moral beings. Now, from a biblical perspective, that makes perfect sense, because the mandate that lies at the heart of Western civilization, upon which all our human rights are founded, is the statement in the Bible that we are, as human beings, uniquely made in the image of God. Now, if that is true, of course, it makes this question of evil even more acute. If we're made in the image of God, couldn't he, as a friend of mine said, couldn't he have made a far better job of it? But let's just paint another background question, ladies and gentlemen. When we look at evil, especially massive and overwhelming evil, one of the big questions that rises is justice. Now, Dawkins says there is no justice. And if atheism is true, ladies and gentlemen, the vast majority of people will never get justice. The vast majority of people on earth today do not get justice in this life. And if there is no life after this life, there's no life to get justice in, so they will never get justice. And yet our human hearts, they cry out for justice. They sense that we live in a moral universe, that there must be something somewhere. Otherwise, our notion of justice is a sheer illusion, and it mocks us. So we have to face that as well. What can atheism say in the context of massive injustice? Hitler murders 6 million Jews, and then he takes a gun and he blows his head off, and he's got away with it because he will never have to face any ultimate question of responsibility. Is that true? I think there's something in every human being that says that cannot be true. Now, of course, a feeling in our hearts that something cannot be true doesn't mean it isn't true. But as C.S. Lewis pointed out, it would be very strange if in a world where we find ourselves with an appetite for food, there was no food. In a world where we find an appetite for sex, there was no sex. If in a world where we find we have an appetite for friendship and justice and morality, there was none. He said it would be a very strange world. And Richard Dawkins said to me once, yes, the picture I paint is bleak, but that doesn't mean it's false. I said, Richard, it doesn't mean it's true either. We've got to investigate the evidence, ladies and gentlemen, as we find our way into this very difficult problem. You see, according to the Christian worldview, the Veritas Forum exists to inject into the general discussion a Christian perspective. According to the Christian worldview, there is to be a final judgment. That's a big thing to say in contemporary society, isn't it? It's an even bigger thing to claim that the final judge has already been appointed. His name is Yeshua, Jesus Christ. You say you don't seriously believe that as an Oxford professor. Yes, I do. I don't know what the Oxford professor has got to do with it. And I'm not the only one. Ladies and gentlemen, whatever you make of it, one of the most marvelous things, it seems to me, is the concept that there will be a judgment. Because it means that our conscience that tells us about right and wrong is not ultimately an illusion. People do not like these days to talk about judgment because they haven't really thought about it. Would you like to live in the United States without police and law courts? Very few of you would be old enough to remember what happened when the lights went out in New York in the early 20th century. And people went completely wild in looting. It was one of the most amazing things. Once the eye of the law had gone, there are many books written on this particular topic. It's fascinating. We do want judgment, but not me, please. That's the problem. And we can look at that a little bit later on if you want me to look at it with you. But let me just stake out the claim. The Christian claim, ladies and gentlemen, is this: ultimately, This world is going to be judged totally fairly, and justice will be done. Do you know what that does for me? It gives me something that atheism by definition cannot give me, and that's hope. I remember saying to my Israeli friends, I said, you know, you imagine you've solved the problem. I'll tell you one thing you have not removed. And they said, what have we not removed? You haven't removed the suffering, it's still there. But I said, may I suggest you've made it 10,000 times more difficult? Because you've removed all hope. By banishing God from the equation, you have by definition banished all hope. So that atheism is a hopeless, in a technical sense, a hopeless philosophy, by definition. But you say, that's a problem, you see. You believe in God, but look, let's face it. You talk to me about a God who created the atom, that's right, who upholds the universe, who invented light, who painted every color, who invented the human mind. Why couldn't he then have made a universe that didn't get itself into such a mess? Couldn't God have made beings that didn't sin, that didn't destroy each other? My answer may shock you. Of course he could. Of course he could. We make them, you know, in laboratories. We call them robots. Of course you can make beings that are non-moral. But now I have a wife, and I've been married to the same one for 44 years, which isn't bad, is it? Now you imagine if I had a robotic wife, a very sophisticated one equipped with a proper screen and, you know, all the kind of sophisticated iPad technology. So I go back from Rice University and my wife comes to the door, there's this screen all glowing, and I see a word marked kiss. So I go, kiss. And I get a beautiful robotic kiss. Well, why are you laughing? But you say, would that be a real kiss? Well, they're making robots that are very similar to human beings these days. But you know that it wouldn't be real because there's no choice in the matter. She's programmed to do what she does. Now let me explain it carefully. Of course God could make a universe with creatures in it that in that sense cannot sin. There are loads of them, animals. When the lion eats your head off in the zoo because you put it between the bars, we don't put him in the High Court. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I think C.S. Lewis helped me a great deal here. I don't think it's the final answer, but it's a way in to see that in order to make beings that have the capacity to love, they must have the capacity to hate. If you're going to have the capacity to say yes, you must have the capacity to say no. And you say, well, why did God do that? Why do you have children? Never forget holding my first child in my arms and realizing that I have brought this little girl into the world. She could grow up to say no to me. Why take the risk? Do you ever think about it? Why do we do it, ladies and gentlemen? Because we realize that granted the risk, the benefits outweigh the risk. To live in a world where love is possible, we all crave for a world in which love is actualized. And you hope one day, maybe you've already got there, you students at Rice, that you'll meet somebody and fall in love with them, and they'll fall in love with you, and they'll value you, and they'll choose you. And the value of that, and you know that it's got an inherent risk. God took a risk to make a universe with people in it, made in his image, capable of choosing, capable of saying yes to God, and equally capable of saying no. Moral beings, that is. So granted that it's like that, there's another question we can ask, and that is this. Granted that there's a risk, did God make any provision if things went wrong? Now here, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to speak to you frankly as a Christian, because other religions must defend their own reactions to this. We started by talking about the problem of suffering. And now I want to tell you about a God who suffered. That conversation with my Jewish friends didn't finish where I mentioned. I said to them, you know, I want to say something to you that's going to be very difficult. They said, that's okay. I said, you've gathered by now that I believe that Yeshua is HaMashiach, Jesus is the Messiah. Yes, they said. I said, I believe something even more that's going to be, well, very difficult for you. He said, go on, tell me, what is it you believe? I said, I believe he's God incarnate. He was God. Now I said, you know he was crucified. Yes. I said, try and come with me just for a moment. I know it's going to be very difficult, but try and come with me. If that is God on a cross, what is it telling you? I said, at the very least, it's telling you this. It's telling you that God has not remained distant from the problem of human suffering, but has become part of it. And I'll never forget his answer. He says, why has no one ever told me that before? Now, ladies and gentlemen, this is a very deep thing. I've made a dozen massive claims that go against the grain of the naturalism and the academy of the 21st century. But the longer I live and the more I study these things, the more I find them making sense after sense. And not solving the problem, but giving me a way in. You say, why would you believe that story? You, a scientist, why would you believe that story? Well, I believe it, ladies and gentlemen, because Jesus gave evidence of being God incarnate by rising from the dead. And I say that, I believe that as a scientist, there is evidence for it. I can't go into the detail tonight, but in my most recent book, Gunning for God, I spend a couple of chapters going through this through the eyes of the skeptic David Hume in order to try and get across the idea that there is evidence that Jesus rose from the dead, therefore death is not the end. And that opens up a whole world of possibilities that atheism knows nothing about. And you say, but I'm hurting. It doesn't take the hurt away. Well, what should I say to that? When I see the suffering of some people, I just say, well, I have no experience like that. How can I comment? How can I say anything? But what I've noticed, ladies and gentlemen, is this. That this message does something at a very deep level. Let me turn it around as I come to a stop in this section. We can argue from now to kingdom come what a good God should, might, possibly, surely he might have He could have, he would have, if he had, and so on. We can argue it. It's been argued for thousands of years, and we remain dissatisfied with the answers. All of us, including me. So perhaps that's not the answer, the question to ask. Here's the question I ask, and I want to leave you with it tonight. Granted that our experience of life is full of ragged, raw edges. I arrived in Christchurch, New Zealand, 48 hours after the earthquake. Had to meet women who'd lost their husbands within just a few hours of touching down. And this was brought home to me. And I remember saying to them, and if you want more, by the way, you can Google my name in New Zealand and see what I said to those people. We find ourselves raw and hurting. Now, granted that that's true, is there anywhere in the entire universe evidence that we can trust God with the dark places, the ragged places, the hurting places? Is there anywhere? And I want to suggest to you, ladies and gentlemen, that there is one place above all, and that's the cross, on which the King of Glory died. You may never have heard an Oxford professor say it before, but you're going to hear it tonight. The biggest thing in my life, by far, is that God so loved me that he gave his only Son for me to bring me forgiveness and peace and everlasting life and hope, not a simplistic hope, but a hope that will endure when planet Earth has gone. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.